Good morning and welcome to another episode of Inside the World of Max Headroom. Um, I mentioned in my last video about McCulty Manor that I wasn't going to do another one. But after I was finished, I felt that I had left something very important out. And it's just sort of like an amendum to the last video that I did. And if you remember, if anybody saw the last video, I sort of took the risk of trying to address what the participants get out of this and how Russ McKamey is quite capable of sniffing out vulnerable people who might need a distraction in their life to perhaps mask or detour some inner turmoil that they have brought to the manor themselves, brought to the party before. Which the purpose of all this, self-abuse and sensationalism and high adrenaline energy may serve a function, may serve a purpose for them. And that's why McKamey's Manor is still continuing to thrive despite all of the negative press that it seems to be getting. And the more negative press it gets, the more it seems to grow. And I said I wasn't going to do another video because I didn't want to give Russ a whole bunch more attention because it seemed like the more attention he would get, the more grandiose he himself would become. But I did realize after I finished that tape that there was a big thing I left out. Because remember, I was talking about the whole being greater than the sum of its parts and having to assemble all those parts in a cohesive whole in order to understand what purpose this serves for everybody. It's very clear that the purpose that it serves for Russ is to gratify some sort of sadistic instinct or impulse inside him. And I addressed in the last video that I mentioned that the contestants also seem to get something out of it psychologically, which, as I mentioned before, may serve the purpose of distracting the contestants from something else that may be hurting them inside. And in a paradoxical manner, it may kind of help the problem they bring to the manor momentarily, much like cutters, drug addicts. I'm not saying that the contestants were drug addicts, but I'm saying that much in the spirit of how a person might rely on chronic use of drugs as a distraction from inner turmoil. One uses self-abuse. I also mentioned bulimia, I think, as being a very distracted symptom that one can acquire. But the one thing that I left out, and it hit me, and I think that this might be one of the biggest variables in the whole McKamey Manor thing in terms of what people get out of McKamey Manor. And that is, drumroll, the so-called actors. Yes, the actors. Think about it. I mentioned that, one of the things that I found that Russ is very capable of doing is sniffing out people who have a need to distract themselves. Well, the thing that I left out was the actors. And I think that they're probably one of the most in need of a distraction from some kind of internal turmoil they have. And I want to explain why. First of all, you probably would notice that, there's all these haunted houses springing up that are like second and third generations of McKamey Manor. Now, they say that they're getting cleaner and they're getting better. I have a funny feeling they're getting worse because I saw, as I mentioned in the last tape, a victim that had a gigantic bruise and was wearing it like a red badge of courage. But she also had mentioned that actually this bruise was inflicted on her, in addition to having her head shaved and all the typical stuff, was inflicted not at McKamey Manor, but at one of Russ's old cult members who had separated from him and started his own group, which I don't even remember the name, and I don't really even care because to me it's all one big hole. But I want you to think about it, okay? What would somebody get out of being one of the actors, or let's just say co-McKameyans or torturers? Okay, what would somebody get out of that? And why, if you got dissatisfied with Russ, would you go on and start something else where you leave a girl who's so obviously vulnerable? And you know, it's so obvious. All the comments I read, I've seen her on many videos, say, "Oh, you poor thing, there's something wrong. You know, what's the matter with you?" So what would somebody get out of taking a poor person like that and torturing her and making her believe that she liked it? And yes, I go back to what I said in the last tape, that it probably serves a distractive function for her, for some inner turmoil that she brought to the haunt herself prior to it. But think about the actors, because you know there's one thing. There's one thing about being scared half to death, but there's another thing about scaring somebody half to death. As you remember, I saw this one guy who was one of Russ's big boys and broke off to do his own thing. Again, I don't want to mention his name and start smearing people. But see, I don't care this time as much about hurting the feelings of, say, the participants. If you remember, I was quite concerned about in my just most recent tape. But I don't really give a fuck about the actors, because they're the ones that are really doing the sicko shit. And they're the ones that are also inducted into Russ's, merry pranksters, because he knows just what kind of people are going to stick with him. And they're probably the ones that would be most in favor of the haunt in the first place. But if you think about the notion that the actors may get something out of torturing, that's kind of an interesting proposition, because they're called actors, but they're not actors. I think that they bring just as many problems to the haunt as I was talking about many of the contestants. But this time, I'm not really very bashful about calling them out, okay? Think about this, okay? It's one thing to be tortured, okay? Because you're kind of helpless, like, you know, whether it's done, whether the duct tape is stage tape, whether Russ is using hypnotic covert induction to try to get people to comply with what things he throws at them, literally. Think about this, okay? Russ is much like Charles Manson, and the actors are much like the Manson family. And who was the one who actually killed Sharon Tate and all those other folks, you know, on Cielo Drive in 1969? It wasn't Charles Manson. I'm not letting Charles Manson off the hook, because Charles Manson to me is like Russ McKamey, okay? But you know, look at the girls that actually, and the one guy, Tex Watson, who did this hideous murder. I mean, it was a hideous murder, and you know, they had to get something out of it too. I'm sorry, I just can't let the Manson girls off so easily. I mean, they were talking about how orgasmic it was to drive a knife into Sharon Tate and all that other kind of stuff. So if you think about it, in that same spirit, using the Manson family and Charles Manson as a metaphor, what I see in McKamey Manor is Russ McKamey being Manson and the actors being the Manson girls. And can you imagine what it's like? Have you ever, you know, everybody pays so much attention to the suffering of the contestants. But if you were to look at the experience just from a distance of the actors themselves, just think about how adrenaline filled that becomes, and how power laden being an actor in relation to the contestants becomes. I mean, they take them and they smear grease, and that one guy that I was talking about before, who actually I think is the like one of the head guys, of which the other woman with the big bruise on her leg, I think that was they're all connected, okay? That guy went on Surviving Life and made two comments that just made me want to fucking puke. And that was, one, he said, I had a girl so scared one time that I was gonna light her on fire. She was so petrified, and it felt so real that she was like pissing in her pants. And he was like saying it so braggadociously, you know. And then he went on to say another really stupid thing, which was, you know, yeah, we do things like make people eat worms, but you know, what's the big deal? A worm isn't going to kill you. Yeah, fucker. But did you ever eat a worm? Have you ever ate one? I doubt it. I don't think so, unless you're some crackhead who gets all psychotic and gets into eating worms. But you never ate one either. So that tells me that you get something out of some kind of lust, some kind of distraction from some sort of problem that you have inside yourself, Mr. and Mrs. actors and actresses, that is basically being fed by Russ and then you to the contestant, and both the actors and the contestants are having a mutual high adrenaline, distractive, abusive experience. In one case, the person's abused, and in the other case, the person's the abuser. But you know, as I mentioned in an earlier tape that I did about snuff and horror, I talked about a movie that was called Snuff, and it's a cheesy movie. But at the end, there's a thing where a woman is snuffed, but in a phony way. And I also mentioned in that tape that at the very end, the guy reaches inside the woman's stomach, which he's just like cut open with a knife, reaches in, grabs her intestines, holds it up above his head like this, and gives a scream that is so lustful and so sexualized and so power hungry that I was like really blown away. That part disturbed me more than watching this woman get cut up and her hands cut off and all that kind of stuff. It was the lust and the adrenaline that this guy, even though he was acting, was experiencing, holding up these ugly, smelly intestines, above his head and screaming like he's having an orgasm. Well, just apply that little analogy to what goes on in McKamey's Manor. Do you realize how abusive those guys are? I just was what stimulated me to do this, because it's very early in the morning. It's only 8:30. But I woke up early and I ended up watching some video about another contestant who was talking about how roughly she was treated by the actors, and that Russ was sitting in a truck directing the actors to take these girls from a bleacher that he told them to meet him at, and started to, just right off the bat, scared the shit out of him. And the one thing that she kept saying was that they were unnecessarily rough. And this girl was like one of these, what would you call it? Like, haunted house freaks. She loves it. She loves spooky movies. She loves this. She loves that. She wanted to take it to the extreme, and she manipulated her way. Although I think she was also manipulated into being a contestant, because Russ was using this technique of saying, well, there's 17,000 people on the list, and she sort of maneuvered her way in. But I think he was setting it up to have somebody maneuver their way in so he could make it feel like it was very important. They were very important, very special. So, okay, somebody canceled and he was going to give them a break if they could get out there in 24 hours. What a setup. What a sham. But that's Russ. But what happened was Russ never showed up at the bleachers. Instead, he's in a truck, and one of the actors comes and starts to really rough him up. And that's what this girl kept saying, was that, she was being roughed up. So ask yourself the question, why the fuck does somebody want to do that? I mean, it's one thing if you like the adrenaline of being scared, but what kick do you get out of scaring the shit out of somebody else and being abusive and pushing them and shoving them and, doing, whether it's stage tape or not? What is the reason that you want to do that? Well, I don't know, except that I know that you must need a distraction from some kind of internal turmoil that you yourself experiences that leads you to a place like McKamey Manor, and then perhaps even gets you to start your own little trip, just like every other cult leader in the world, for Christ's sake. And, my hypothesis is that, you get something out of it. And it's not just, to help Russ or to assist in providing some sort of incredibly freaky experience for someone else. It's because you get distracted from some kind of internal turmoil, or you have an incredibly sadistic streak, much like Russ. Maybe it's even sadomasochistic, because many of those actors have gone through the haunt, then go on to be the haunters, you see? So maybe they have a sadomasochistic sort of tendency that ends up sitting at one point through Russ's manipulation more on the sadistic side. So I'm making two hypotheses. One is either the actors are either distracting themselves by harming other people and experiencing that lust of power and control over a helpless person as a distractive function, a detour from some kind of internal turmoil, or you are sadomasochists that got into the manor on the masochistic side, and then also discovered that you have a taste, and Russ probably sniffed out that you also have a proclivity toward liking to be sadistic as well. It's either one or the other. Because otherwise, why don't you get a job? Why don't you at least flip burgers? What would you get out of wanting to torture somebody unless you yourself are sadistic or you have a need to distract yourself by harming someone else? Many of these guys, just remind me of serial mass killers. And they're just finding a way to legitimize it because nobody dies. And I think in trying to, again, look at the whole as opposed to the parts, to put this whole McKamey Manor narrative into a cohesive whole, you have to look at Russ and Russ's sadistic tendencies. You have to look at how he, I hate the word grooms, how he manipulates contestants into going into the haunt, and then how he takes some of those prime contestants that he's sniffed out who may have a proclivity themselves to needing to be distracted by from some kind of internal turmoil or have a sadistic edge like Russ, like what's that, it takes one to know one. Maybe he sorts those folks out. But see, then what they do is many of those guys break away, act like Mr. Righteous. Oh, Russ McKamey. It's like President Trump, just criticizing everybody when he's the guilty fuck, And I hope that comment doesn't get me deleted, but nonetheless, I don't think much of America can argue with that. And so, I got an issue with you so-called actors. You're not actors. You're getting yourself off. How many of you got a climax while you've been doing that crazy shit? I really would appeal to anybody who wants to start a haunted house. Make it a haunted house. Do some background checks on your employees. Make sure they're not a bunch of redneck coke freaks. I'm sorry, that's totally speculative. But I've read quite a bit of controversy about Russ and his merry crew being into accelerant drugs like meth and coke and stuff like that. Who knows? But it doesn't matter. You actors are not actors. You're gratifying yourself. And I'm very regretful that I left that part out because it didn't dawn on me, really. You get so focused on watching what happens to the victim or the participant, the contestant, that you stop watching, and you don't even see what their faces look like. So you can't see what the actors or the torturers are how they're reacting to this because they've got those masks over their face, and they may be in certain ways worse than Russ. So I just had to get this out here. Remember, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So in order to understand the McKamey Manor narrative, you have to understand it from all angles and link all those little pieces together with a thread. Just like, what good is a pearl by itself? You can't do much with it, right? But if you put it on a string, you have a necklace. And now you have something that's very cohesive and very clear. And so in trying to clear up the McKamey Manor narrative, I felt an obligation to come out and just get you all to examine also the actors. They were often contestants before. They were, manipulated by Russ to become part of his merry pranksters. And I'm sure that either they have a problem inside, that the high adrenaline of torturing and controlling somebody else just distracts them from any sort of insecurities. There's an old Adlerian phrase, you don't have to be superior to avoid feeling inferior. And I think that's what this is all about. Maybe these guys feel a little insecure about their package or something. I don't know. But, for whatever reason, you have to ask yourself, what is it that would draw these people not only into serving after being tortured, but then to become actors, so to speak, or co-conspirators in this whole hideous, bogus thing, and go on to be, open up their own places, and then and try to outdo Russ. Well, when they say they're going to outdo Russ, I really have some questions that without there being some very well in place controls or standards of what is a haunted house and what is really haunting somebody. Those standards don't exist. So when those guys break away and start their own thing, and they're saying, well, we're better and this and that, but then you hear the same guy who broke away say, oh, what's the big deal about eating worms? But has he ever eaten worms? And he's proud of himself. that he's, you know, gotten some woman to believe he's about ready to set her afire. He's not getting something out of this? And then and you think it's just a paycheck? I don't even know if they get paychecks. They like doing it. They like doing it. They're not much different than serial killers, I don't think, except they just don't kill anybody. But that may sound, oh, everybody says, well, how can you say that? Well, I'm saying it. They're bogus people, and they have their own problems. And like I said, they are either sadomasochistic, sadistic, or have some pre-existing problem that they need to distract themselves by taking power and control and exerting it over somebody else. And the high adrenaline and mushing their face in mud and all that other shit. It's fucking disgusting, as is the whole fucking McCulty Manor. And that's it. I had to put this out there. I hope this sheds a little bit more of a cohesive whole, or gives you a little bit bigger, broader picture of what the whole fucking McKamey Manor is about, because it's stupid. It's really stupid and harmful. And this has been another episode of Inside the World of Max Headroom. Good morning.